Greetings, friends. How you doing today? It's me, Christian. Well, I guess on this YouTube channel, I'd be the WorldSmith. Nice little play on words there, isn't it? WorldSmith. It's my friend Trip came up with that one. I like it a lot. But it's nice out. My neighbor's house is over there, so I'll probably be in the shot a little bit. But also sorry, I'm really bad at this camera stuff, so we'll work on that. But today we're going to talk about generally how to stop writing shitty fight scenes. And you've seen this or read this, or it's been in some anime or manga before, and sometimes it can be really cool, but then there's stuff that just leaves you feeling like it's just lackluster. And we're going to go over what you can do to improve that. So we got a couple topics we're going to work through pretty quick, I hope. And we'll see, how I like it and how y'all like it, right? The first point I want to go over is under detailing, over detailing, and the visualization sweet spot. At some point you've read a story. This is mostly a reading thing. This doesn't really apply to film or to anything related to that. Oh, that's a really bad angle. Bad sun. Because this is a descriptive related thing. So this is more important for people who write. Mostly for books. Now, under detailing, you've seen this. It's when some writer, your author, is trying to convey that, or they just don't want to take the time to write it out, but they want to convey that somebody's better than somebody else, or just generally don't know how to write details. So instead of trying their best, they just say, well, this person fought that person, and they exchanged a few blows, and that person won. Mr. Action Hero won. Because Action Hero has to win. That's just how things work. Look at my neighbor's lovely long fence. Anyway, but that's just how it's got to happen, right? Mr. Action Hero wins. And so it's a very low descriptive thing, and it doesn't do anything for visualizing a fight, which can make a story very interesting, right? It helps it stay interesting. When you can see what's going on, it helps keep things intriguing and fun. Now, not all stories need this, because sometimes the point is not visualizing the action. The action is a means to an end. This is something that's more common in myths. But most stories these days, people want to see things. We're used to visual media. And so your job as a writer, as a descriptor of events, is to help people visualize, more so now than ever before, as we get better and better animation and better film. Now, people who recognize this find themselves falling into this gap of issues, over detailing. Now, I'm sure you've seen this as well. You've probably done this. I've done this. When it comes to over detailing, it's pretty straightforward and obvious. You put way too much in, to the point where instead of being a clear visual description of what's going on in a given story, you end up, I guess for lack of a better way to put it, describing things so precisely that nobody can visualize that. Nobody can see it in their mind's eye when it's going on. So when you do this, you really shoot yourself in the foot, for lack of a better way to put it. I'm saying that a lot, aren't I? I guess I am. So, to kind of paint a picture pretty quickly, say you have Mr. Action Hero and he's fighting, right? Let's say they're melee fighting. We'll do swords. I like fantasy. Swords are cool. Other weapons are cool too, but swords are cool. And as part of the fight, he's fighting somebody really good. And so he wants to kind of help it be more fast-paced, but interesting. He wants you to see just how good his opponent is. Let's say I had a name for it when I was coming up with ideas for this video. The bad guy's name was like Mr. Dog Kicker, aptly named for his abusive tendencies towards small animals. And Mr. Dog Kicker is really, really good at fighting, and so Mr. Action Hero can tell that he's extra careful because he's never careful in any other life and death situation, of course. You have to communicate that Mr. Dog Kicker is good somehow. But as a result, they start describing things. Mr. Action Hero swept his sword in an arc over his shoulder at precisely 22.5 degrees because that's helpful for me figuring it out. For one, a degree measurement is only as useful as it is what is it relative to. Is it 22 degrees relative to the horizon? Because and from what perspective? We're in three-dimensional space. It's kind of hard to get a good grasp on what that means. And so you can't visualize it. And another thing that's kind of similar to this is using words that no one understands to describe something, or coming up with move names. It's cool for anime and for other things where you're naming something, because this can be kind of interesting to have a cool special move name. They do this in WWE and other things where they have like a particular move type. And this applies to real world martial arts. So it's not completely out of the question, but it has to make sense. It has to be understandable. It can't be nonsense. So you can't come up with a triple worm twist stab into a feint, into a whatever else, because no one knows what that is. Now, some things people will know, and you can use those. So if you're presuming that your audience knows what a feint is, and most people who like melee combat in a fantasy setting, or even in some sci-fi settings like Star Wars, or something else where you have a sci-fi sword of some kind, then all of a sudden they might know what a feint is because they've experienced it before. Someone has educated them on that. But if you aren't educating them on that, or it's not something that people typically know to expect, it could confuse. So you have under detailing and you have over detailing. Now you're going to have to worry about finding a spot in between, that sweet spot of visualization. This is important because then you have enough detail for someone to understand what's going on, but not so much detail that they're trying in their mind's eye to train that into something practical that you want them to keep reading. They want to keep reading. Give them a reason to. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is death, and how it's really not as immediate as you might think based on Hollywood. Now, experienced fighters or people who have seen things, soldiers mostly in the modern day, and some people who are particularly brutish in their past, or have seen people be brutish, brutish, not brutish, will have experienced that people tend to not die as quickly as is convenient. This is something you see a lot in action movies, where the action hero, the main character, or one of the main characters, stabs somebody or shoots somebody and they die immediately. And the reality is that's not how it works. And they don't do this when it comes to the heroes. The heroes sustain so many wounds and keep fighting, which can be abused, but is often realistic. Again, depending on situation. There aren't many blows that are immediately and instantaneously fatal, after all. So a big example of this would be if you're in a sword fight. I'm going to keep on going back to fantasy because screw y'all, I like fantasy. But in a sword fight, if someone sits there and stabs somebody in the gut, but they didn't guard themselves. This is a real world fight situation, and people who know HEMA will experience this in their training. You cannot, in the pursuit of a lethal blow, expose yourself to a retaliatory lethal blow. Because despite what the movies might make you want to believe, and what you might want to believe, it's not going to be immediate. Yes, a stab to the gut with a sword or a spear is very likely to be lethal, especially in a world where you don't have modern medical technology, and even then there are certain situations where you just can't get away from it. It's a very, very potentially mortal wound. But you don't die immediately. The only thing that gets close is if you somehow were to black out from the pain, which can happen, and that needs to be emphasized, that can happen. But don't abuse that like a lot of people do. Understand that the person who gets stabbed is still capable of movement, and so you can't expose yourself to a retaliatory mortal strike. A lot of duels in history ended in both participants dying, either on the field or later from their wounds. You kind of have to keep that in mind. Death is not immediate, so that can really play into how you write a fight, and that can help make things more realistic and keep the pressure on, right, to position right, because then you realize that it's not as simple as taking their king in this game of physical chess. You can't risk it, because just because you are going to be able to take their king this turn, they still get a bonus turn or two where they could take your king. And then you run into a big issue where, you die because you thought it was as simple as stabbing him. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Decapitation tends to end things. Brain injury can do the same. Knocking somebody unconscious is immediate. But don't assume that anything that doesn't affect the brain directly will have that effect. So this also ties into realistic pain and wounds, because generally people can fight through a lot of pain. When you're in a fight, there's a lot of adrenaline going on, which results in, you know, you being able to ignore more pain than you normally would. And my boxers and martial arts guys might have an idea of how that works. But everyone else, take it at face value, I'm right. But you have to factor in what wounds do and where, you know, would this realistically be something that would knock somebody out? Would they bleed to death? How long would they take to bleed to death? And you can research things or just give a guess, but don't ignore the problem, because that's how it became a problem. You ignored it in the first place. All right, so on to my next point, and I'm just really sweating out here because the sun is hot. It's mean, it's evil. Oh, yikes, that was rude. So my next point, I got a piece of paper because I got a bad memory right now. I'm just distracted, so forgive me. But the next point is how you can envelop and integrate real fighting techniques and how they can enrich your written fights and your own visualization as a writer. Now, this is something that definitely applies to film and to comic and manga, although those are stop motion, so it's not as much to them. But understanding how real fights work, and I just touched on this, understanding how real fights and fighting styles and weapons are work and are used can have a big effect on how you write something. So for instance, if you understand that you can't justify wounding the other person mortally at the expense of your own potential death, you have to think more carefully through how your hero will have to fight. And if you can communicate that to your audience somehow, which is normally through experience with your work, so you'll do it once or twice, maybe show them that, hey, you got hurt in the process of winning, and so it was a Pyrrhic victory. For my history buffs, that made you smile. For people who don't know, a Pyrrhic victory is the idea of you won, but at what cost, right? You can't proceed forward. You won, but they won. Technically, that you can't keep fighting. It came from a historical event where a Greek general, Pyrrhus, won a battle, but it decimated his army so severely that he could not continue his campaign and had to return home, which kind of voided the whole point of going out to war anyway. So, armor isn't worthless. Swords are sharp, and spears are actually pretty freaking great, all right? So what do I mean by this? Well, for one, this is something that is seen in all media from people who don't understand what's going on. If you have a person in armor, you have to understand that the armor serves a purpose. That purpose is protecting them. If armor worked as well as it appears to in most movies and a lot of books, why would anyone bother to wear it? It bogs you down, not tremendously, not as much as people think. It's actually a lot more flexible, even in full plate armor, than you might at first guess or assume. And if you don't believe that, there's all kinds of videos out there about people in full medieval plate, Gothic plate, running around doing gymnastics and parkour and whatever else. It's really cool. So armor isn't worthless. It was designed to protect you. And so you should do a little bit of investigation and research into what that means. Figure out why armor did what it did, what it was designed to do, and how you can integrate that. Because all of a sudden, your tactics, your viable tactics as a fighter change when you have real armor. And that's why the sword in the later medieval period became a more of a sidearm weapon. It really was always a sidearm and not a main battlefield weapon, but there are swords that are an exception, of course, but that's a whole different discussion, and we can talk about that later. Now we're gonna go on to swords are sharp. Okay, a weapon, notably in this case a sword, but a weapon is designed to accomplish a task, just like a piece of armor is designed to accomplish a task. This was not by accident. Our ancestors weren't idiots. So they designed weapons to accomplish a particular goal. Swords were for cutting and thrusting and all kinds of things depending on the design of the sword. Spears did things and halberds did things, and they served different purposes. And you have to understand what that's for. But for one, on the title of this, swords actually were sharp. Don't believe any of that weeaboo crap. And I love anime. No, that's not an insult. I'm just joking about it. But katanas were sharp, yes. So was a European broadsword, arming sword. If a sword's not sharp, it doesn't cut well. Swords are sharp, weapons are designed to do a certain thing. If you want to have a weapon in your story, understand it. Quick note about swords and armor. Swords do not go through plate armor. They don't really cut through chainmail really good either. Understand the combinations of things, and you can have fights that are really interesting, where you realize that there's sharpness and reach and penetration, all these other factors that combine to make a weapon lethal in a certain situation, but another weapon worthless in that same situation. And why would you carry that weapon if it's worthless? Because it might be worthless in a different situation. But you know, another digression. Welcome to my mind. Now, the last point was that spears are great. This is particularly about spears, but it's also to illustrate that other weapons exist. They're good, they have a purpose. The spear was the main battlefield weapon for the majority of ancient history, medieval history, just history in general. It has reach, because you don't want to be close to the guy that's trying to kill you. If you can keep him away, that'd be great. That's what a spear's for. Have a nice long stick with a pointy end at the basis level. And it's good for keeping you alive, because you keep the bad things away. And especially good in formation, because then it's not as swingy. Swings can be difficult for hitting teammates, allies. Depending on the weapon, of course. That's why like flails, like you see like the Witch King of Angmar in the Lord of the Rings series and movies. You get this giant flail. You notice that it doesn't hit anybody because nobody's around. If he was alone, that works, sort of, questionably. If you're in formation, it doesn't work at all, because now he's taken out 40 orcs. So it's not really working for him. But it's not just about spears. Weapons that weren't swords existed for a reason. And it's good to understand that reason, because you can have a diverse cast of weapons that understand their purpose, and then you can really enjoy it. And be happy and satisfied with how your writing has improved. You have a problem-solving mentality towards your writing, which is just generally kind of cool. And it's not just for you. You don't have to describe things by knowing you can know the historical techniques and describe them to the reader without using the term, or then you run into tribal language issues. Because if I say Zornhau, you say what? I said what, I still say what. It's a hewing technique in German fencing, but I don't really know. Someone can tell me, but I won't get it until I see it. The point is, tribal language, be careful, just careful. And that's gonna about wrap it up. I hope I've given you and my fellow writers and other enjoyers of fiction a lot to consider. Think about your writing, think about what you can do to improve it, what you could have done differently. Look at your fight scenes, see how much they match up, or if they don't match up, see what you might be able to do to fix it. Editing is great, you can change stuff. Don't forget that, it doesn't have to be perfect in the first run. You can change it whenever you want. You're the author, not the characters. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. A lot can be done to improve your fights, or any fights in general. Keep things like this in mind. Think through issues. Think through how you can fix those issues. It's getting dark. No, it sounds behind a cloud. Take time to research what could be useful for your story, right? Find out what weapons did, what purposes they served, what they were good for, why you would want to do them, right? And then discuss with your writer friends, with your reader friends, talk about it with your parents, with whoever you have. Even if they don't necessarily get it the same way you do, you can explain it to them, and by explaining it to them, you'll understand it better right there. So that's about all I've got for y'all today. Thanks for tuning into the WorldSmith for my first video. I know my camera sucks. Oh, not as much the camera, my cameraman. I'm the cameraman. Sucks. But we'll get better. Anyway, be sure to subscribe for more awesome videos in the future. Farewell.